Okay, so we're going to get started. And hopefully Derrick will join us. First, we're going to go around. I'll call your name if you can introduce yourself, your pronouns, preferred pronouns if you'd like, and then also your role today. So if you're a student, where you go, just real quick introductions. Sandra's our background host, so I don't know that Sandra wants to introduce herself, but she's a Chicago Reader staffer who's given us our time today and set up the Zoom. Okay, so Matt, why don't you go first?
Hi, everybody. I am Matt Simonette. I am managing editor of Windy City Times. Ignore the Dave Mark for the moment. That's my husband who has the Zoom the Zoom account with me. So I will be speaking today with Emmanuel Garcia, who's two people down below me in the Zoom box.
And my name's Tracy Bain, she, her, co-publisher of the Chicago Reader. Adam, you want to go next?
Yeah, totally. Hi, my name is Adam Rhodes. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the social justice reporter and staff writer at the Chicago Reader. And I will be talking with my illustrious editor, Karen Hawkins, today.
And Karen?
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you bright and early on a Saturday morning. I'm Karen Hawkins. I am co-publisher, and I see a lot of nodding. It is early. Tracy's been up for 9 hours too. I am co-publisher and co-editor-in-chief of the Chicago Reader and founder of Rebellious Magazine. I'm very happy to be here. And my pronouns are she, her.
Andrew?
Yes, I'm Andrew Davis, he, him, his, and I am executive editor for Windy City Times. And I've been there, I think, since like 1876. And today I will be speaking with Sky Cubacub, who is an advocate and I would say a fashion designer extraordinaire.
Emmanuel?
Yeah, my name's Emmanuel. My pronouns are he, they. I've been a storyteller and community organizer for coming on 2 decades, which is awesome. And I will be presenting later with Matt.
Kate?
Hi, I'm Kate Sassen. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the LGBTQ plus reporter at the 19th. I am going to have such a hard time getting through this training because I just want to say hello to all of these people that I missed. And I'm paired up with Derrick, Clifton. So that's very exciting for me.
Sky?
I'm Sky Cubacub. I use they, them pronouns. I run a clothing line called Rebirth Garments, which is for queer and trans disabled folks of all sizes and ages.
Excellent. Derrick?
Hello, everyone. How are we doing this?
Name,
hey, Derrick.
Name, pronoun, and your role today, what you're doing.
My name is Derrick Clifton. I don't have an exact pronoun preference, so please use they, them. And I'm a panelist today.
Excellent. I think I got all the panelists, so now I'm going to go to the attendees. Whatever, just briefly what you would like to say about yourself and the place you are in the journalism space, et cetera. Start with Emily.
My name is Emily. I go by she, her pronouns. And right now I'm a senior at DePaul and I do some production for our news show.
Excellent. Anna?
Yeah, hi. I'm Anna. I use she, they pronouns. I'm a senior at Northwestern studying journalism. In addition, I also study gender and sexuality studies and theater.
Kaylee Padar?
Yeah, my name's Kaylee Padar. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a fellow at Windy City Times and also a senior at Loyola studying journalism.
Tarina?
Hi, my name is Tarina. I interned for Windy City Times in 2016. Right now, I'm a graphic designer and digital creator at my own company called Dual Designs.
Max?
Hi, I'm Max. I use they, them pronouns primarily. I'm a fellow at Windy City Times, and I am a junior studying journalism and gender studies at Northwestern University.
Excellent. Louise?
Hi, my name is Louise. I use they, she pronouns. I am a senior at UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago, and I am the managing editor for our independent newspaper, UIC Bonfire.
Excellent. Josiah?
Hello, I'm Josiah. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a recent graduate of Northwestern University, Medill, and I currently don't work in the journalism space.
Henry?
Hey, I'm Henry. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a fellow at Windy City Times, and I'm currently a sophomore at Northwestern University.
Hope Thompson?
Hi, I'm Hope. I'm a sophomore at Northwestern University.
Excellent. Trent?
Hi there, I'm Trent. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a junior at Northwestern studying journalism.
Excellent. Did I miss anybody? I think I got everybody. Excellent. So we're like we said in the email that we're going to do 4 approximately 25-minute sessions. I'll let folks know when we're nearing the end of each 25-minute segment. And if you have questions in the chat, I'll call them out so that the moderator and the panelists don't have to pay attention to the chat if they can't. And we'll definitely have a little bit of time at the end as well. And if you have follow-up questions, you have our contact information. We're really happy to have all these amazing panelists locally and nationally in our group today. So I really, you know, there's a lot of really terrific talent on. So if you take advantage of questions, but if you're shy and want to do it in chat, that's fine. We'll also ask people if you want to do it verbally later, and then certainly later by email. So we're going to start off with Andrew and Sky.
Thank you. Thank you. And I am really honored to be part of this, I have to say. I'm also really honored to talk with Sky because I know they will have a lot of interesting perspectives about the topics we discuss. I actually wanted to start off, Sky, concerning your background and what you do. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Rebirth Garments and also the concept of radical visibility.
Yeah, so I am a queer, non-binary, xenogender, Filipinx, neurodivergent, and disabled person who's lived in the same building in Chicago my whole life. And I started Rebirth Garments in 2014 after a new disability started for me. My stomach kind of stopped working when I was 21. So I stopped being able to wear a lot of the clothing that I had previously been able to wear because it was all kind of too painful on my stomach. But I had also dreamt of making like gender affirming undergarments like chest binders and packing underwear and tucking underwear since I was in high school when I was first kind of questioning my gender. I already was like very out with my sexuality, but I was thinking that there was something else there for my gender. And then I basically decided to make this clothing line where it encompassed all of my identities because I thought there's probably other people who are also queer and or trans and disabled. And I was right. So it's had a great amount of success and I feel really lucky to be doing what I can do. And I have had the support of the Windy City Times for so long. Like I feel like basically since the beginning, lots of articles. So
30 under 30.
Yeah, I was also 30 under 30. Now I just turned 30, so.
Ooh, happy birthday.
Thanks. And then, yeah, radical visibility is the ideology behind my clothing line. Here I have my manifesto here. So I wrote this queer crip dress reform movement manifesto, and it's just all about taking up space, taking up visual space, physical space, auditory space, as queer, trans, disabled folks of all sizes and ages, and making sure that we are not ignored and we aren't assimilated into mainstream Western beauty standards or, you know, ideals that are damaging to us. So, yeah.
So I'm kind of on the inside looking out as a journalist. What is your perception of how LGBTQ plus people are covered within LGBTQ press and also the mainstream or outside of that press?
I would say that within LGBTQ press, it's a lot better. I have done an amazing amount of interviews. I think I've done a couple hundred, and around 100 or maybe a little bit more are published. And it definitely seems like the people who are not queer have a lot of problems. And it is mostly a nightmare. Usually I will do an interview and people like, I'll think that the journalist is on the same page as me. They'll be like, oh wow, like I'm learning so much, like cool, totally, like yeah, I totally get it. And I'll like be like, okay, make sure that my pronouns are correct, and you know, make sure you don't say thing. I mean, this is separate, but you know, still connected, but like make sure you don't say like my models are suffering with their disabilities or things like that are like very insulting and like I don't know, dehumanizing. And they'll be like, oh yeah, totally, I would never. And then like I look at the like every time I read an article, I like hold my breath and I read through it really fast because I'm just like skimming through being like so like yeah, when I have journalists through queer press or through like, or somebody who's queer that is doing like an independent thing, it makes me feel a lot more at ease. I'm way less nervous. I'm also less nervous about the, like, I've had people misquote me very badly. Like they'll like basically write the opposite of what I said. Like, because I'll be like, you know, anti these Western beauty standards or something, but sometimes I think that it's so, I don't know, new to like these concepts might be so new to them that they'll like flip it because they're like, oh, surely you meant this. And I'll be like, oh my God, you have to please fix this because you're saying everything that's like against my ideology. Although luckily there's so many interviews out there with me that are like, you know, talk about my ideology that I think people now will recognize like, oh, well, that's just like definitely wrong. But like a lot of my friends comment on how they didn't know how much people were like misquoted or dead named or like things like that until, or like yeah, misgendered until they would hear about my experiences. But yeah, I mean, even when a queer person is writing the article, but it's not for queer press, it can still be really scary. Like, yeah, a cool queer person wrote for my, oh yeah, Chicago. I was named the Chicagoan of the Year for the Chicago Tribune in 2018. And yeah, the Chicago Tribune was being very weird about pronouns because their editor was like, this isn't grammatically correct. They end up, that journalist ended up quitting like immediately after. They were like, this is gonna be my last article and then I'm gonna quit because I don't want to deal with them anymore as like a queer person. It's too hard. And then yeah, and then now I know that the Chicago Tribune was like taken over by like super conservative folks who like really, they like really have taken a stance against using they them pronouns. So that just like is really heartbreaking.
So when these mistakes happen, do you ever reach out to them and say, hey, can you correct this? And do they ever take responsibility or take accountability?
Sometimes that I always do reach out because like anytime there's anything wrong, just because I'm like, well, I don't want you to, you know, have something that's wrong. My first time was actually with the Medill. I think that the Medill was I think they wrote the first article about rebirth. And there was just like a couple of things that were just wrong. Like I think the person just misheard, but it wasn't too bad. It was just like, oh, like I just want it to be accurate. But I know that the Medill and Northwestern has like really, I feel like way too strict. I don't know, the culture around it seems a little too strict to me. Like they were like, oh, I can't do this unless I get it like approved or something. And then also I noticed that the student, like if they expressed any emotion at all, they would apologize and be like, I'm not supposed to do that. And I'd be like, it's okay, you're a human. So it seems like the Medill and Northwestern has like very intense things that they try to put onto their journalists that I'm like, I don't really experience that from any journalist outside of the Medill. Like other journalists, you know, have opinions and emotions and things like that, and they're allowed to express them. It's like, yeah, so that's one thing. But yeah, with the New York Times, they misgendered me. They wrote an article about trans lingerie, like trans affirming lingerie, and they misgendered me. And I knew if they misgendered me that they probably misgendered other people in it, and they would not change it. Like I emailed them very nicely being like, hey, I told you my pronouns and you didn't do it. And then they were like, oh, well, we can't change it. And then I found like an article from that the New York Times wrote about the New York Times being like, no matter how small of a mistake that we make, we will always correct it. So then I sent them that article being like, hey, y'all, you guys wrote this and you won't change it? Like that doesn't make any sense to me. And then they like wrote back and they were like, no, we really can't. Oh yeah, what on earth was the reason they just were like, we can't, like it's not important enough or something. But then I had to like take it to the internet, because usually I try to like, you know, solve it internally. But then I was like, this is absurd. Like if they're doing this for me, and like for me, I feel like, I mean, I feel terrible when people misgender me, but I don't feel as terrible as like I know other people do. So I'm like, it's really important for me to advocate so that they don't do this to somebody where it could really, really affect their mental health in a negative way. So yeah, I basically just had to make a post on Instagram calling out the New York Times and tagging them a bunch. And then I had like, I don't know, hundreds of comments tagging the New York Times, yelling at them. And then I got some message from somebody being like, I got the queer mafia on it. And then it got changed.
Because you posted and you were like, look, I have the receipts.
Yeah.
So,
and I was like, you know, I like crossed out the journalist name, although people could tell because they could just look up the article. But
I actually want to go back. I think Adam had a question about what can queer reporters do better? What are some things we can improve on?
I mean, for everybody, not just, I think it's good to just like do lots of research. Like I definitely can tell when people have researched my work before they ask me questions. I think, I mean, I guess it's different for like bigger publications, but I've done a lot of interviews where I feel like I'm doing like a book report on myself, which feels very strange. I'm like, I don't need this for my grade. Like, because like people will like look through and like grab things, but I have a lot of resources like on my website that people can read, so they don't even need to ask me that. Like, and I'm fine with like elaborating, but yeah, when it's like something that's like directly answered on my website, like very clearly, and it looks like they read the website, but then they just were like, I'll just take the question and I just want to hear you say it again. I'm like, that's unnecessary.
Now, do you find coverage controversial regarding race or ethnicity in any way?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people can be like cowards about talking about race, especially about like Black or Indigenous folks. Like, so I am really into Jen Deerenwater, who is a queer Two-Spirit Indigenous person who's actually modeled for me. They're like a really awesome reporter. Jen started Crushing Colonialism, which is like a, Instagram and website and stuff. And I highly recommend Jen's work.
What's that person's full name again?
Oh yeah, here,
Jen.
I'll put it in the chat. Jen Deer in Water, like
Okay.
like the, yes, there, perfect. Yeah. Oh wait, and back to what queer reporters do better. I still have queer reporters who will misgender me. So I don't know, I guess just being double, extra, triple check a bunch of times what pronouns to use and what name to use.
And to learn from your mistakes too, because
Yeah.
a true confession time. Like 8 years ago, 8 to 10 years ago, I used the word transgender, but I put an ED at the end.
Oh yeah.
And I almost immediately heard from GLAAD. I got an email stating that when you put an ED at the end, it sort of emphasizes the process, not the person. And I've never forgotten that.
Yeah.
So I think, if you just remember and also research and show some respect, just respect people and what they want to be called, acknowledge who they are. I think doing all those things are important.
For sure. Yeah. Before I started Rebirth, like when I was writing my manifesto, I did like so much research. I read a ton of queer theory, a ton of crip theory, a ton of race theory, a ton of like fat theory. But I also, I actually interview every single one of my models. And then also like any clients who want to be modeled or who want to be interviewed. Not everybody wants to, but I interview everybody and I really like catalog it in my brain and in my notes, like so that I remember, how people like, just like maybe, and it helps me come up with all of my ideas for my clothing, like through the interviews.
And actually, Tracy just mentioned something for everyone, but it points to the fact that the language is evolving so quickly too.
Totally.
So what do you think people can do to quote unquote keep up?
I mean, always talking to young folks, like being tapped into what young folks are doing, I think is important. I've been volunteering at the high school that I went to since I graduated from my high school. So I feel like getting to always talk to them keeps me more current. And I'm always like, if I start to sound like I'm saying things that are out of style or not, in use anymore, like, please tell me right away. I want to know. But I always am doing constant new research. And I mean, I think that Instagram is a great resource for learning about new things. It doesn't need to be strictly academic. But pronouns change, identities evolve. Like, I think people will sometimes look at articles from 6 years ago when I was still using she, her pronouns, like kind of just being like, I don't really want to, but I'll do they and she just to like make other people more comfortable. But and then I know a lot of people who haven't changed their pronouns online necessarily, like on their social media because of their parents or things like that. So and that's a huge thing. If like somebody can't be like, if you need to talk, sorry, I'll start over. I have a couple of folks that I work with where it's very important that there is like nothing online about them, or if there is something online, I have to use like a different name, like just like kind of an alias. And or like if you think about people who maybe they can use whatever their name is, but maybe they aren't out in certain ways and can't have any but don't want to be dead name, then you can just use their name instead of using any pronouns. So just like repeating their name. even if it feels like, I don't know, wordy or something, it's more important to keep them safe, but also keep them feeling, you know, affirmed in their gender. So you aren't misgendering them, but you also aren't naming what their gender is so that people don't get scary at them.
One word that seems actually kind of controversial, even within the LGBTQ plus community, is the word queer.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love queer. For me, like most of my identities, I like whatever is the most umbrella, like biggest, most open term. Like once I get into like when I first came out, I was like, I guess I'm bi. And then I was like, no, I'm a lesbian. But then I was like, oh, I feel so boxed in and uncomfortable. What did I do? What did I do? I was like, I can't do this. So like for me, queerness is like the best. Like it just feels so good. But I have had a lot of, maybe not a lot, but I've had a couple of mostly older trans folks, especially who have been like, I can't believe you could possibly use this like disgustingly insulting word, and things like that. And you know, I think it's just like the evolving language, like listening to how people want to self-identify also, like, and like not judging, like, yeah, it's fine however you want to self-identify. It's like, maybe you don't call me that or something, like, or like, I think it's fine if people want to set that boundary, but like, I don't think it's cool to be like, you can't call yourself that in any way, like, yeah. So like, just listening to people, but also like, yeah, understanding that language evolves. Ooh, what can reporters do better about writing about disability? Oh, I actually do have a document. It's not like comprehensive, but I have a document that I made that had some like do's and don'ts that I would like send specifically to journalists. Sometimes.
I was going to say, you have a glossary on your website too.
I also
correct?
have a glossary. Yeah. That one's like, I need to update everything, like, but I will put a little thing. I hate when people are saying like, this person suffers from this person is like, so I have this friend, Matt Frazier, who's an actor, and in all of his articles, it's always like, the thalidomide victim does this or something. And then he's like, oh my gosh, like, like just say like disabled actor or something. I mean, generally the disability community likes the word disabled. Handicapped is like very old school. I mean, it was never the word that we chose for ourselves. Like it was the word that able-bodied folks like put on to.
Yeah, sometimes
disabled
people.
Folks, I know some people. Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say sometimes people go with differently abled.
Yeah, I don't like that just because it seems kind of patronizing.
Okay.
So yeah, I would say that like, I think disabled is the safest, but I mean, right, however they self-identify, but and yeah, maybe just like asking people how people self-identify would be really good too. But also never saying like things like wheelchair bound or like confined to a wheelchair, confined to a bed.
Okay.
Even, yeah, like, so saying like wheelchair user or like, or just like, yeah, asking how people want to be described, I think is always.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. Again, you know, respecting that person and the research that we mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, one thing that I see in articles a lot is people being like, this thing is tone deaf, like when they're talking about something that's like just like really out of touch. And like that's definitely a thing that like the deaf community does not like. So yeah, and just like trying to not use disability as metaphor in like weird ways, like being like, they were blinded by this. It's like,
Oh, gotcha. Huh. Tracy, 1 minute warning. Is this 1 minute until the questions or 1 minute
Yeah.
until the?
Yeah, 1 minute until we'll have a couple minutes for verbal questions, and then we'll go into the next panel. But feel free to put resources in there throughout the 2 hours, and questions that if we can get back to you later on. So feel free to use the chat, or in a minute, if you want to wrap this, and then we'll do some verbal questions if people feel more comfortable verbally asking.
cool.
Okay. Well, Sky, is there anything you want to say in conclusion?
I mean, yeah, I guess just like listening to people is always the most important. How they want to be described.
It's like we have one mouth and two ears for a reason.
True.
Cool. So did anybody want to ask any questions?
Karen put one in the chat. You want to ask that out loud, Karen?
I did. Hello. Should publications commit to changing pronouns and past coverage?
I mean, I think that would be really cool. I would love that. I mean, I don't really understand how people are like, this is so hard. Like, I'm like, y'all have computers, right? Like,
And also, should people's names be changed?
yeah, I mean, that would be, I know it's harder in print publications, but if it's on the internet, like, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, at Windy City Times, we've had over the last 20 years, some of the most, we've had people ask us to change if they came out as HIV positive, if they're looking for jobs, if they had a criminal arrest that didn't go to prosecution, if they've had a gender change. So when we're asked and people send us the link and we can change it, we have for the most part done that. If there's something related to the public record where there's actual harm done, it's like do no harm. If this person did something behavior wise that erasing that record is not a good thing. Totally. But that's a rare situation. I think, Andrew, we've been it's like do no harm, like is changing or even removing a story, which is very rare, but we have done that. We have because of potential violence. We had someone who was out as the first openly trans man in Chicago that came out in the early 2000s, and then they took a job that put them at serious violent risk. And we removed what we could remove, we removed. There were some PDFs and things like that that weren't searchable, that weren't taken down and didn't cause any problems. But I feel like unless there's some overarching historical thing, that the do no harm is the most important thing. And we've had requests to the reader as well, when it involves something that is really currently traumatic to someone's career or livelihood, their life, their children, et cetera. So it's, the do no harm thing. The past of journalism that had where you can't change anything was in a different kind of past where no internet existed, where people could change and evolve without the baggage of 50 years of the internet on their lives.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. Like, I think that's really great that y'all focus on the do no harm, because like the BBC wrote a horrifying article.
Oh yeah.
About disabled folks and calling like disabled influencers like faking it and things like that. And I know one of the people that is in community with me is just like having tons of death threats and things like that. And it's just like, what the hell are you doing, BBC? Like, and they did this article under the guise of like they did these interviews, but they didn't say like what the premise of the article was going to be, that like people were like faking it or something. So like, and like, yeah, that can put people's health insurance, which also then can put their lives in complete danger, just like in that way. But then also like the death threats, just like, but also it can have such a bad impact on mental health that it can make the person have like SI and like that, that's just like completely unacceptable. And I'm so pissed off at the BBC for doing such like a damaging thing for our community.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to move on to the next panel, but for sure the chat's going to keep going. We can do follow-up questions at the end if there's something that comes to mind. But our next, thank you so much, Sky and Andrew. That was fantastic. And next we're going to move to Matt and then Manny. Manny, can I call you Manny?
Okay. So primarily I'm going to be interviewing Manny for this. He promised to come back with some questions if he had any for me. But just to give a good introduction for him. Manny is a storyteller and community organizer committed to queer and trans liberation. His journalism experience includes print, radio, and oral histories focused on advocacy journalism to highlight immigration, healthcare, and employment inequalities through a Latino queer lens. In 2020, Emmanuel co-directed the documentary Seguimos Aquí, Pride, Pandemic, and Perseverance, a film exploring resilience through the experiences of 4 Latino Chicagoans who identify as LGBTQ+ as they navigate the COVID-19 pandemic in their personal and professional lives. So most of my questions this morning for Manny are really gonna center around how he has intersected between doing journalism work and activism work. Those are 2 spaces he's been occupying for years, and places where they overlap and where they come apart from one another. So Manny, first, why don't we just start out with, why did you become interested in doing journalism work, and how did you start out there?
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to say that as many times as I've done this and that I've interviewed other people, I can never not be nervous. Like I hate being on this end, as I'm sure a lot of you can identify with that. It's just a lot easier if you're kind of the person in the wheel of the interview and not being asked questions. So thank you, Matt, for being so kind, and all of you for, if you hear my voice crack, it's really just being nervous, you know? So the only other thing that I wanted to say about the piece that Matt mentioned in the bio, in the introduction, was that I'm also the Development and Communications Director at Crossroads Fund, which is a public foundation in Chicago that supports grassroots organizing here in Chicago. And I say that because I feel like journalism and my experience in journalism has really helped me like land a job like that because of, you know, the communications piece around my work. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. And I think I'm gonna give a big shout out to Tracy Dame because I think my kind of like the genesis of how I got involved in doing journalism and getting involved in community work really was Windy City Times had a sibling publication in La Vida, which was primarily focused for Latinx LGBT community. And I was invited by Tracy to write a column just about like what it was like to be a young, you know, queer Latinx person, you know, and that's kind of how it all started. And she really identified and my voice and the importance of my voice and how important it is to tell someone like, look, like your voice is important, your voice matters, you should be writing more, you should expand, think about what you want to say, what does your community want to say, what's happening in your community. So having someone like that was just such an important thing for me is getting involved. And so I want us to think about too, all of us, just like how do institutions open the door for people who are not formally involved in like a journalism program? You know, how do we involve community in the ways that they tell their own stories? And so I feel like I'm a product of that. And so that's how I got started. I got started within La Vida. I also got sent out by Windy City Times to cover a lot of events. So I really got the confidence to go up to random strangers and ask them for their pictures and their quotes and who the hell are you and where is this going to show up? And, you know, sometimes I would be like, oh yeah, it's going to be for People magazine or whatever, you know? And so, yeah, it was, that confidence was built because of doing that type of work. And then I went on to do public radio in Spanish for a program called Homo Frecuencia, which was like the only Spanish language LGBT program in Chicago and in the country. And I served as producer and as host. And so that improved my Spanish, I will say. Yeah, so that's how I got started in this work.
I think you bring up an interesting question there, because I studied journalism in high school, and then I kind of wandered into it over the years as well. So maybe how do you think that institutions can open up the door for folks who don't have a traditional journalism background? You know, if you wanted to get into that and report on specific communities and so forth, how would you go about that now?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question too, Matt, because I knew that I was presenting this and that could be something that would be asked.
Back in your face.
Yeah, exactly. But I was thinking about how like I don't know if this is something they did in your high school program, but they do this. This is like a journalist activity where you give people like a camera and you let them document their day and things like that. I think there's a way that we can pass the mic. I use that example as like a way of passing the mic. Is there a way that you can like tell someone like, look, like, how do you want to tell this story? What's important for you in telling this story? So really involving people in the story piece is really empowering those people to think of themselves also in a way as partly the journalist, the storyteller, not that this story is being told about me or about my community, but that I'm helping to tell the story. So I do feel that there is a way to involve people in telling their story in journalism without necessarily, having them become part of the staff.
Well, which issues in BIPOC communities do you see as either being underreported or simply badly reported in mainstream media or even alternative news sources?
Well, I really appreciate Sky and Andrew's piece, because I think for me it highlights that there's so many issues. I'm talking about a specific community. I'm talking about things that are in my kind of like sphere, but that's not true that that I'm covering all the things. And so there's so many issues. So there's always something that we can learn. And that's what I love about journalism, is that you're constantly learning about issues that maybe you're not closely connected to. And so our job is to get it right? It's like you have to learn the language, like what's the language that these people are using, and like, because we're not in all of the communities. I think that's the importance of like the intersectionality piece. For me, what I see is like, we did a survey, as part of this project that I was doing to address like homophobia and transphobia within the Latinx community here in Chicago. We did a community survey of like what people wanted to learn about, and we would do the survey after we did a whole presentation, like a LGBT 101. And the one thing that always, no matter what happened, who it was, how old they were, rose to the surface was everyone wanted to know about the trans community. They wanted to know what the issues were for trans people. They wanted to learn more about the language, And so I share that because I think there is really a hunger to learn about issues from communities that don't have access to this language, right? And so, and specifically the Latino community in Spanish, there aren't a lot of opportunities to really ask questions. Like I was actually having this conversation with someone recently where I was thinking of like, how many like, Latino organizations are using pronouns to start their meetings that are just Latino focused, like not like, I feel like in like English and Anglo culture, like that's something that's just become so mainstream in like progressive circles, whether it's like an LGBT meeting or not, like institutions are just using pronouns, it's like part of the language, part of the culture. And I don't necessarily know if all cultures have that, subcultures or like other cultures. So I'm only speaking about mine, where I don't see that happening in like predominantly like Latino spaces, organizations that are not LGBT or that don't have like queer leadership in them. So I'm sorry, I'm going on a tangent, I think. But I think that's important to use that, so take what you want from that piece. But I think so. I think trans issues are something that we can report more on, and that obviously badly reported on with misgendering people, using dead names. I think immigration is still one of those issues that we don't hear enough about. It's such a global issue. It's not like just a Mexico, US issue. It's a global issue. And like, that's something that we just don't hear enough about, that there hasn't been significant changes in immigration in like 30 years. And so I think that's really important. And I think even most recently, you know, like COVID-19, you know, like we aren't hearing enough like nuanced and complex stories about the impact of COVID-19 to communities that primarily are Black and people of color, who are like first responders, essential workers, like who are all these people, and are also, you know, queer, trans people who are living, you know. So I do think that those are some of the stories that are, you know, not being like really reported on, or are being badly reported on, if you will, for lack of a better word.
I'd like to get to a question that Anna asked, and that is, do you ever grapple with the dual experience of participating in activism versus documenting the work?
Oh, wow.
I had a question for you. Where do you see a line between activism and journalism?
Yeah, I think I think I can answer that and then see, because I think it's I think one, just to answer this question, I think you have to be very clear about what you're doing, like what your role is, you know, like is your role as a activist to document the work, that you can have that role, you know, like that can be your role, is to document the work. And then there's a role of like, you know, being the participant in activism that's not doing the documenting. So I'll say more about that when should I answer the question that you asked, Matt, about?
Yeah.
What was the question? Sorry.
What is the line between activism and journalism? Where do you?
Yes, and well, I think one of the things that I was thinking about with this question was, you know, like, I think in journalism schools, you're going to learn about the importance of being, you know, unbiased and ethical. And, you know, I think reporting the news, like the facts, and letting the readers like make their own opinions. I think that's harder, I will say, just thinking about like communities that are marginalized, and when I think about like who gets to define what neutrality is, and what is being biased. And I think about like just the how language in itself is just you know, and how we use language can be such a powerful place for communities. You know, when we think about like pronouns, you know, like names, identities, I think about like the history of reporting our communities, like the HIV/AIDS epidemic, you know, like same-sex marriage, LGBT youth activism. You know, I think about like what it means to be like out, you know, like I remember, and I'm sure, Matt, that you remember this, and that this still happens, is that, you know, when approaching someone for a story, maybe they're not out and they just they want nothing to do with, they want to tell the story, but they don't want to tell it to you because you're writing for an LGBT publication, and they just don't have a connection or to be associated with that. Or I think about like someone who, you know, doesn't want their picture in a publication because they like just all of that, just that history, and how much like the big changes that have happened in the past 2 decades have really influenced, you know, the way that people are more open to sharing their stories. And so, so it's hard to say like what's the role, you know, what has been the role of journalism in like activism when our communities have been fighting to have this voice, you know, and now we have it, right, in many ways. And but what's also lost, like what's been lost from people having had to like not feel empowered to tell their stories. Like we've actually lost a lot, you know, like I think how many people rejected me to tell their story because they weren't out. And that's such a loss, you know, like anyway, so that's what it just makes me think about. Sorry, I just go into like this history piece, but
yeah. And actually, we had an interesting question from Kaylee, which I think what you just said kind of leads into this. And when it comes to letting people tell their own stories, are there certain strategies you use in interviews or encounters that you say specifically to include people and make them feel more in control of their stories and kind of less like they're being bombarded with questions?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, I think there's a couple things. I mean, I personally, I'm a bit, well, depending on what the project is, like if, you know, you're doing like a live interview or something, I think I like the pre-interview. I think that's important. I think it's just important to, the one question that I think is good to ask is like, what do you want to get out of this? Because sometimes we have ideas of what we want and why we want to tell this story and why we got to sign this story. But it's like, what is your goal in telling this story? Like, what would you like to make sure comes out of this piece, you know? And starting there and finding a way to honor that along the way, you know, while you also get what you want out of the project, you know. And so I think that's one way. And then also, I mean, just being transparent, you know, like I mean, I don't know like how people have put this into practice, but also like, you know, sometimes showing the person, look, this is the story that we're going to run, you know, like, what are your thoughts? You know, I'm always very careful about that because you don't want someone to come back and be like, let me play editor, you know?
Right, you don't need to add an extra editing process.
Yeah, and then it's like, well, now I don't have a story, but you do want to be able to be transparent and just and involve them as much as possible. So I think that just asking like what your goal is and telling like, I want to ask you these questions, or I have this story that I want to tell, but I'm curious to know based on that, like, what are your thoughts? What would you like to come out of this, you know? Yeah.
Okay. And how do you see relatively newer social cultural perspectives? And I'm thinking of just like the notion of intersectionality, which has been around for decades, but it's kind of new-ish in really being talked about in our political scene now, benefiting reporters in people reporting on BIPOC communities.
You know, I see this, I don't know that I see it so much in like being like reported. So I'll say like one, like I feel like the Black Lives Matter movement or the movement for Black lives has just really pushed all of us to think, all communities to think about intersectionality.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that we are starting to, because we're having these conversations about race, racism, white supremacy, I think that is really forcing us to think about intersectionality and like how, when we talk about issues, that we're not just ignoring how they impact Black and POC communities. And so I definitely feel like that we're making so many gains because of those movements in journalism and in the way that stories are told. And also like one of the things that was talked about earlier was like, you know, language is just constantly changing. And I feel like, you know, I see it also in the way that I feel like younger generations are just more intersectional in their thinking from the get-go, and they're really just kind of doing their own version of stories. Like you always see memes of like, I fixed it, like the headline, you know?
Yeah.
And I love that. And I think it's like I see it more in that way, in that people, that the public, right, is just way ahead. Like they're just way ahead of all of the story that's being told in many ways, and that we just have to listen. We have to listen. And it's like change. And yes, and that includes like language too, you know, like yesterday it was Latinx, today it's Latinay, you know, it's like, and so which one is it? And which, you know, so like all of that. And so we just have to listen and not kind of like, you know, yeah, so I'll stop there because.
Well, I think that's something that I'm certainly learning from this whole presentation. You know, I've done, you know, I've checked with people's pronouns for years now and everything, but I frankly, you know, I've never thought about like the issues that were raised in Sky and Andrew's discussion about checking how a person with a disability would like to be referred to. I haven't thought about that before, and so this is, you know, and you know, I've never found with pronouns that anyone has ever minded being asked their pronoun. You know, it has been that's something that nobody has ever had an issue with. I work for another community newspaper, and they had a big meeting where they were worried that they would offend people by asking about their pronouns, you know. So I think, you know, as you say, just going back to listening to your subject is one of the most important parts for being a reporter. And we just got the 2-minute warning from from Tracy. So I think we can turn it. If you don't, do you have anything else that you'd like to add, Matt?
Well, I just wanted to add to what you were saying, and it's something that I know it's going to sound random, but I learned something about it. But I was listening to someone. It was like this. I'm gonna plug it. It's like it's called Shoot Your Shot. It's like a Black gay dating live on Instagram. It's really fun and entertaining. It's not my space, but I definitely just love being a viewer. And what they were talking about, someone was having like sex with or whatever, and they were saying like the person is straight. And it was a guy, it was like same gender. And so they were like, well, no, he's not straight, he's gay. And he's like, well, I know what he is, but I want to respect what he wants to be. And can I just tell you that flip for me was like, oh yeah, that too. And now we're at that point. Like it's now benefited straight people, you know, like it's like all of this language change has all just like this respect for like everyone's identities, and like it benefits everybody. So anyways, I just wanted to throw that morsel out.
That's very cool.
They took a lot of things like significant other and all sorts of things that evolved out of communities. Yeah, partner. Oh my God, they steal all the good stuff.
Yeah.
So do we have any verbal questions before we get to the next panel? I want to thank Manny and Matt again for wonderful dialogue. This is it's really making me want to do this for at least once a year. For folks. And again, if you know, we're always happy to have dialogue after. I do want to say one thing about the activism and journalism stuff, because, you know, when I started in 1984, just being someone who used my real name in a gay newspaper was seen as being an activist journalist. So that evolves as well. And I have jumped off the journalism platform to organize the March on Springfield, which put my reporters like Kate and others in a awkward position of having to cover something I was actually running. Transparency is the key, right? You got to just make sure your readers know, you know, Tracy Baim is the publisher of the Windy City Times. This is the march she organized and we're covering it. And take that for what you will. So it's just really important to be clear about the ways you're subjective. Everybody is subjective, whatever lens they come through, and you just got to work against that and be transparent and just own it. Any questions, just raise your hand if you have any. Otherwise, we'll go on to the next one. And again, feel free to put questions in there. I'm going to hand it over to Kate and Derrick.
Hi, all. Good morning. It's early in LA, so bear with me here. I'm so excited to be doing this with Derrick. It's a real throwback for me. So Derrick and I are just going to talk a little bit about sort of the different paths we took to end up doing what each of us does. And then we were going to ask each other a few questions and then leave some time for you all if that works for you. So Derrick, do you want to just start and tell us a little bit about your journey through journalism?
Sure. First of all, I'm excited to have this conversation with you, Kate, and be with you all today. This is really wonderful and uplifting. I got into this by complete accident. I'm not gonna lie to you. I grew up on the South Side of Chicago, Inglewood and Wrightwood. And for me, I didn't necessarily have the best relationship with the press growing up because all I saw covered about my people was who got shot, where there was a drug bust. There was never a coverage that I saw routinely, at least, of my community where it was focused on the assets, on the people who were starting businesses, the community organizations that were out in the trenches. It was always this kind of parachute approach that was taken. So it ends up being about, and some of it's by necessity, right? Like we have to report on crime and things like that. But when that's all you report about all the time, it turns it into a nasty trope. So to be quite honest, I wanted to be a weather person instead. I wanted to be the next Tom Skilling. For me, it ended up being where high school and college, I got involved in some ways in queer activism on the campuses, and just witnessing a lot of, for me being a queer person of color, a lot of, tokenism or lack of resources being devoted to the community in ways that honor our contributions, that honor our needs, really got me in a bit of a tiffy. I was really upset. And I just started writing, blogging, and talking with people who felt a similar way because we were all so scattered, especially I went to Northwestern for undergrad, for full disclosure, and where my class was maybe, one of the lowest matriculation rates for Blacks in the history of the school. We were maybe 3.5% Black, my graduating class. One of the lowest rates. So that was a flashpoint of activism, but there were many other different elements that kind of came into play, including the fact that the LGBT Resource Center at the time was converted from a storage closet. I know the irony of an LGBT Resource Center being formed out of a closet. But, so that's where I started to write. Of course, I wrote opinion first before I dabbled into reporting. Thank you, Windy City Times. And of course, getting started writing opinion journalism, I think it was for me about not only going with my gut and kind of getting a thumb on the pulse of what was happening on my campus, but also doing the research, going to talk to people. And not just necessarily giving, my own point of view, but making sure that it was an informed point of view. So that way people could, really be able to continue the conversation, or I could engage in that conversation with people. So from there, I continued on to report and kind of had still had a tense relationship with press after college, didn't know exactly how I was going to fit into it. But I just kept following the path, even though I didn't necessarily have the training. And then I went to grad school at Medill and felt like I had to really carve my own niche in the program to really report on the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality in ways, because it didn't necessarily fit into the kind of cookie cutter molds that most traditional journalism schools kind of carve out for you in terms of what you can and cannot do. And that's where freelancing really helped me to kind of develop my own voice and help me understand and see that there are media out here who actually do care and who make an effort, even though they may not be necessarily mainstream, you know, they're definitely valuable and worthy. And then from there, reported on the Black Lives Matter movement, on issues of race and culture, on evolving terminology in the queer community, things like that. So it hasn't been a complete love fest for me, but it's been worth the journey. How about you, Kate? Tell me more about your journey.
I love hearing the story. Derrick is one of my favorite Chicago reporters. They've done amazing work. So Derrick, thank you. And also I got to see them sort of starting out at Medill. So thank you. I also kind of started out at Windy City Times. I graduated in 2008. I'd done some professional reporting in college in Haiti and a study abroad, and decided that I really didn't like being a white reporter in Haiti covering a community I was not part of, and that felt really gross. And so my family, my brother-in-law's from Port-au-Prince, and I ended up there, and I'd done work that felt important, but upon graduation was I want to do actual reporting, and I want to grapple with some really hard questions about who has access to communities, how stories are told, and started to develop this idea in undergrad about how I felt like journalism was not the product of a reporter, but was a process that an entire community participates in, and the reporter's one part of this, right? And so after graduating, I did some freelance work, couldn't get hired because I graduated in 2008 in a recession. I was openly trans at that point. I don't know that we had the word non-binary in use. I identified as genderqueer, I think, at the time, but was trying to get work, and no one wanted to hire me except for Tracy Bame. So Tracy and Andrew saved me, gave me work, and I started out as a queer reporter in LGBTQ media, and from there sort of worked my way through Chicago doing reporting, eventually moved to Boston, and then to LA, where I worked into Grindr's LGBTQ outlet until they shuttered that and folded it. And I went into mainstream queer reporting. And now I work at the 19th, which is a gender politics and public policy outlet. It's kind of like ProPublica, if you know ProPublica, where Derrick has also been, in that all of our stories are free to redistribute. Yeah, we cover the whole country. So it's really a blessing to be there. And I cover LGBTQ politics. So that's kind of my trajectory that I wanted to share with you. One of the things that I wanted to ask Derrick about that I feel like we don't talk enough about in media is the changing scene of ethics. So, and I think this is something that Medill sort of always drove home and raised. I didn't go to journalism school, Derrick did. And when you go to journalism school or you read journalism books, they always tell you there's a set of rules, right? How close you can get to sources, the kinds of off ramps you're allowed to provide for them, right? So you're trying to get sources on the record. You want them to spill all their information to you. And I've never felt comfortable with a lot of the rules that we have in journalism, right? They don't feel actually ethical. And so I wanted to talk through some of those things today with Derrick about how they handle sources and these ethical questions. And are they actually trauma informed? Do they serve the communities that we try to reach? And what are the standards that we should be setting for those sources? So Derrick, I'm wondering, can you talk through what are some of the issues that you found that hit pain points for you in the reporting that you do?
Sure. I think probably the one thing that really irritates me the most, and I know it irritates a lot of people when you are part of a community that you cover, is that somehow, and I know this was alluded to in the last session, that it makes your reporting inherently biased, or that somehow you are doing the work of protecting and advocating for your community rather than covering that community in a way that, you know, is fair and balanced, the whole notion of objectivity in a way. But that, I think that that kind of framework that has been served in journalism actually looks at being part of a community from a deficit standpoint rather than from an asset standpoint, right? Because I think it helps so much to understand the nuances of a community from being part of the culture, so that if there is a controversial situation that does crop up, or someone in that community causes harm, you can actually fairly report on it and build those relationships in ways that, yes, you know, protects people who need to be protected, because, you know, not everybody can speak on the record, or, you know, can keep their jobs, or, you know, maintain some of their own relationships that they need for their day-to-day life or their professional life. You know, we have to remember that people who are sources, you know, can't necessarily be out even all the time. So, you know, for me, it's just about recognizing, number one, that in taking a human first approach to the work that we do, and centering that humanity above all else, and then get to the issues and the nitty gritty.
I love that. That feels really important.
Yes, and I guess I would ask the same question your way. What would you say is like probably the biggest pressure point for you in terms of covering what you cover and having to, you know, kind of wrestle against the traditional, in many ways outdated notion of ethics?
Yeah, I feel like one thing that I always grapple with is this idea of people being allowed to take things back or go back off the record. Or there was this conversation, we talked a lot about like changing articles after the fact, or just how do you make people feel safe? And one thing that I do for people who come forward in stories, especially like in investigations. So right now I'm investigating an LGBTQ bar, the Abbey, over a lot of people go to this bar, have one drink, and then sort of black out. So there's allegations of drugging at this bar. And I'm interviewing a lot of people who are not sure if they want their name associated with the story. Or they really want to share a lot. They feel like they have something to contribute, and then they might share a lot and after the fact have regrets. And I think the old journalism rule is that you try to get people to share as much as possible. Like you just try to crack people open or something like an egg, you know? It's like, and I feel like really, as I've gotten more comfortable with myself, good at that, right? And like I'm a trans person who has access to trans people, and I've been in community for so long that I feel like I could do that. And that feels really dangerous. Like, to do that with people who survived druggings, or to do that with people who are incarcerated and might experience actual violence. And so I feel like my job has evolved now into being like, I actually need to let people know what they're up against if they decide to do this, and also provide them an off-ramp. And I say to people now, like, look, I don't offer this to like, you know, a congressperson. I don't offer this to a public official or, you know, a corporation. But you are a survivor of something, or you are in a precarious situation. If you say something and later it feels not good, it feels unsafe for you, we can talk about what that would look like to report that for you, and how to keep you safe, because my goal is not to destroy your life. And that's something that I feel like historically we haven't been taught, that like feels like a violation of whatever traditional journalism ethics we had. But it feels like the only ethical way to report.
Absolutely, and the story you just shared reminded me of a piece that I had written for the Reader maybe about like 5 years ago, where there were a collection of Black queer women who were, instrumental to the local Black Lives Matter, local iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement, and one of them pulled out at the last minute. Mainly because she was involved with an activist organization that was educating, young people, Assata's daughters in particular, but at the same time was a public school teacher. So there was this tension between, this idea of an activist education that she couldn't necessarily give in the classroom, and then having, of course, being part of very, avant-garde confrontational by necessity protests, and then being employed by a city agency in so many ways. So, that to me, it was painful to cut that part of the story, but it was necessary because like you mentioned, and I think that's what we're getting at here, is that, talking to the press sometimes comes at a cost, for people. And we have to remember that, not everybody's most personal inner stories can always be featured. And if they want to say, hey, even before a story publishes and you're about to hit send, take me out, be considerate about that, I think is a good rule.
I'm going to interrupt I'm not sure if you're paying attention to the questions, but Emily had a question about what are ways you can create a safe space for interviewees?
Yeah, I'll feel that. I think, yeah, some of the ways we've talked about are maybe helpful. The things I like to do are, before we have a conversation, I do like to lay out and say, this is how this story might impact, your life. These are what some of the repercussions might be. And also, here's what your options are in terms of the way that we navigate this conversation. I think, again, in old school reporting, like there was this rule of like, it's on the subject to know all the rules of like, what is on the record, what is off the record, what is on background. And that's like a terrible way to go about doing things, because like most reporters don't even know what they're talking about when they say those three things. So, and it means something different for everyone. It really does. And none of this is even a legal terms. It's all just subjective. So, I like to sit down and say, look, like, here's how we can do this. Let's make this comfortable for you. Tell me what feels good. And I will, I want this to feel good for you. I also, there will be moments where I can sense or feel like the person is getting really comfortable and sharing things with me that I'm like, I don't know that they want this in the story. And I can sense that. And I think we all can sense that. Like we all have this gut check mechanism where you're like, yeah, I don't know that they want to be talking shit about their mom at this moment, and not to be a quote, and be like, hey, can I just check in with you about this? Like if that were published, how would that impact your life? Like how would that rest? And like to just go over things. Anytime you have that gut check, to revisit that with them, I think is a helpful way to create that safety, or to say, hey, like you did report this agency. Have you considered that this might cost you your job? Like, have you considered that, are there things we have to do on our end to protect you? Yeah, I've just, yeah, I would recommend those things. Derrick, do you have things that you want to add on that?
Yeah, I would say also taking, when people are talking about things that are personally traumatic, I think a lot of what we can sometimes end up being taught in J school is, oh my God, get the soundbite, get the quote, get the emotion, like get me into like their insides in so many ways. It's like if that person wants to give that to you, it is a gift. That human vulnerability is a gift, but it's not necessarily where you want to exploit that for the sake of getting the quote, getting the story, right? You want to make sure that the person you're speaking with, like Kate mentioned, feels one, comfortable making that public, And sometimes we have to just, check in with them and ask them that. But two, ask questions in ways that don't necessarily make the person have to relive what they went through, but allow them to discuss that on their own terms. In a way where if you need to ask follow-up questions, you can just say, hey, if you'd rather not go down this road, feel free to tell me, I need to take a pause, or I need to step away from the interview, or I need some time to think about how I may want to answer that. And that's okay, because we have to remember that not everybody is, I know, like, I do corporate communications outside of freelancing, so we often say the term media trained, but people, not everybody has the same comfort level doing interviews, or the amount of experience doing, multiple interviews at the same time, things like that. So we have to just remind folks of what they're getting into when they get into it.
I put another question in the chat if you'd like to address that one.
So this is a question about pronouns, right? And let's see.
Yeah, this was an advanced question. They'd like to discuss the use of the singular they when it goes against AP, and also dead naming, and how what impact that, the problematic use of that. And if you can explain that for folks who may not be familiar.
Now, I'm pretty sure AP allows for they, them pronouns, doesn't it now? Am I wrong? Everyone uses they, them pronouns. New York Times, even, for the most part. I had a fight with a publisher at the West Hollywood local paper about they, them pronouns like a year or two ago. And they wouldn't use they pronouns. And I was like, it's ridiculous. And he was like, well, major publications don't. And I messaged the style editor at the New York Times, and I was like, you use they pronouns, right? And he was like, yes, absolutely. I just sent it to him. I was like, see? I think a lot of times we just don't, yeah, I know. NY Times is serious. I won't get started on the New York Times, I can't. But I feel like we're in this space, historically as reporters, where we just are weirdly unwilling to give our readership credit for being able to do very basic things. We all know what they, them pronouns are now. It's been a long time. And even if we don't, we're adaptable people. I love when people are like, I'm too old, I can't use they, them pronouns. I'm like, you figured out how to use an iPhone. Are you kidding me? You can adjust. You're gonna figure it out. I believe in you. Stop giving yourselves a little credit. It is possible. So yeah, I just have very little patience for publications that will not give their readers the credit of being able to do these very basic things. And I feel like that's bad writing if you can't make it work, honestly.
I see we have the 2-minute warning. I want to add to that as it relates to debt naming. What really, I'm just going to be really frank here, what really just upsets me is when there's the insistence on using someone's government name when they may not have had the opportunity or the resources, depending on where they live, to get that changed. When that can come down to a few considerate questions, especially from people who were in their lives, and that by that I mean people who, not just their family, depending on the level of family support, because that's a factor, but also just keeping in mind that, hey, if it's a name they used, respect the name, go by it. In the reporting. And if for whatever reason you get a police report, and that's the other thing, some people treat police reports like Bible and verse when they shouldn't. if that's the name that a publication is going with first, they learn otherwise, they need to reverse course and then change what they published before. I think that's the most considerate practice, because it otherwise is going to reinforce the disrespect, that this person may have had to deal with by, not having their proper pronouns or their proper name used in their daily life, or they were alive. Why reinforce that insult to injury, not only to the person and to the community, when this person has, perished or died? I think we have to just keep that in mind.
That was a wonderful conversation. Are there any other, raise your hand if you want to ask a verbal question? First, we'll go with Max and then Luis.
I just wanted to ask your opinions also on doing the name, who uses they, them pronouns kind of thing, because I've noticed that trend a lot. And it's usually only used on people who use they, them pronouns, and it's never like a cis person who uses she, her pronouns or uses he, him pronouns. And so just wondering what your opinions are on that, because I've had some editors push back and say it's to be more clear. But I feel like it also can sort of ostracize or put the non-binary person usually in question as an offset to the cis people in the story.
Our style guide at 19th News is not to do that. And we are very mainstream. I don't think it's necessary. And at this point, it's pretty stupid, honestly. I don't think people need it. I think we've seen they, them pronouns. I think for other things that you're introducing for the first time, fine, maybe, but I don't think it's necessary anymore. Derrick,
We had to do it years ago when there were lots like the ZIR. Sometimes again, it felt like people would think we had a typo since we had typos in things. So sometimes for clarity, but what do you think about it when it's one that's not as common in use, Kate?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, if it's something that you have to educate the reader on, that's fine. But they, them is it's just so common at this point that there's just not a reason. I don't.
Thanks for the cat, Anna. We had a cat visitor for her. Luis, you had a question?
Yes. So I recently just had a close community member and a youth organizer just passed away via gun violence, and their name was their dead name was used in a lot of publications, and their pronouns were wrong as well. And I know that their family wasn't very supportive of their alternative name or their name and their pronouns. But I know that a lot of close friends and close members of the community really wanted to respect their pronouns and their name. And I was just wondering if there was a way to advocate for someone who had just passed away, who couldn't advocate for themselves in the way that they were written about. Yeah, because we had a lot of trouble navigating this situation because it was really harmful.
Yes, good question. And as Karen said in the chat, I'm sorry for your loss. I think, when we see the bylines are there for a reason. It's in many ways there so who wrote the story, but also in many ways to hold that reporter and by proxy the publication accountable for what they write. I would say it's a matter of not only reaching out to the reporter, but also whomever else is on the masthead who's an editor, and giving them the information that they need in order to know that, hey, this may be someone's, government name, but those of us who were in community with this person, we knew that their name is XYZ. And that needs to be reflected in your coverage. And saying that plainly and, sorry, I think my internet is going out. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm here. I think being upfront about that helps. Kate, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll also just say, if it's several publications, and I'm so sorry about your friend that's really awful. If it's several publications, that's a lot of emotional labor. It's a really hard thing to have to ask for, to like treat your friend humanely. And it's also a complicated thing to have to do that over the wishes of a family who's not recognizing your friend. I would say that GLAAD can be a really helpful resource. Nick Adams and Alex Schmitter run trans advocacy for GLAAD, and their job is literally to go to media and correct things like this. And they can go and just say like to these publications, hey, here's how this actually should be done. And they can actually do that advocating on your behalf to correct those articles so that they can deal with the complicated nuances between like dealing with someone's family of origin versus their chosen family and all of those things, and deal with that with media. So you don't necessarily have to.
Thank you all for your questions and the presenters. I wanted, in case we're going to lose people, I wanted to take a photo for those who can be on camera. Turn your camera off if you don't want to be on camera, but we'd like to take a photo of this. So Joshua and Katrina, if you want to be on, but anybody come off if you don't want to be. I'm going to do it in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Okay, excellent. So we're going to move to our final panel. I am going to throw some of the advanced questions in the chat. If other panelists or the current panelists will want to address them, great. But I just wanted to make sure to put them out there since people were kind enough to give those questions ahead of time. We did answer quite a lot of those advanced questions just normally in the conversations, but I'm going to put a few in that are a little bit different. So our final panelists are colleagues here at the Chicago Reader, Adam and Karen. Take it away.
Yay, thank you. Thank you. And thank you all for your attention. So 90 minutes on Zoom is a lot. So deep breath, if you can take a deep breath, everyone. Roll your shoulders back, do a little stretch. We're almost done. We're in the home stretch. Thank you so much for your attention. It's always helpful to just work it out a little bit. All right, Adam, we're gonna try to be serious for this conversation.
I believe in us.
I believe in us too. I also just want to name that we are also both Medill alums. So yeah.
Medill represent.
Right, so
Okay.
putting that out there. So I know I'm going to take this, I'm going to put you all in gallery view because you're so hilarious. All right, so Adam and I are really just going to interview each other and do the thing we usually do, and talk a little bit about our journalism, origin stories, how we got to where we are, and then get like super tactical about like how we come up with story ideas and how we find sources and organizations we rely on. So Adam, if you can go first, what's your journalism origin story?
Yeah, totally. So I don't have a very fancy journalism origin story, actually. My first year of college, I went to like a very small liberal arts college, and I was like a pre-law major, and I took like a single constitutional law class, and I was like, oh, this is like the most boring thing I've ever read. Just like the professor wasn't like the tea, like the class was like very small. I was like not into it. And so I remember having like this like small internal crisis about like, I was really good at my AP government class. I only thought I was going to be a lawyer. What do I do? And then truly in the most Cuban way possible, my mom told me I should be a journalist. And so like my mother was just like, truly, she was just like, you know, you really like writing. Have you ever like thought about journalism? And I was the person, I read like the paper every morning, but like for whatever reason, it like did not connect that this was a job. And so the liberal arts college did not have a journalism major. And so I was like, well, I guess I need to like a GTFO. And that's when I went to the University of Central Florida, where I majored in journalism and like truly hit the ground running. Like I got there in like September, and by January, I was an editor at the school paper. And so like, just like truly was just like, this is what I like to do. Like, it feels really good. It was like the first time in my life, like, I think we all have had this experience relatively, but like when you're writing a story that like you're really passionate about and like you think you're doing a good job, you just like kind of have that like, ooh, this is what I like to do. Like, I'm doing it. I had that feeling. And like my very, very, very first story ever published was about Pride, like the Pride celebration in the city. And like that was kind of what gave me that like what signaled that journalism, particularly like queer focused journalism, was where I wanted to be, because it just felt good to be like in community with people, but also just like reporting, and like that kind of mix felt very good to me. So now your turn, Karen.
I love that. So I will give you the abbreviated version because I'm so much older than you are, Adam. So I always knew I wanted to be I've known I wanted to be a journalist for a really long time. I have journalism in my family. My grandfather used to write essays. He worked for the post office as his day job, but wrote essays. I have a cousin who's a copy editor. So I always knew that that was an option. And then on the other side of the family, they're just super nosy. So I feel like being a journalist was a way to blend like my love of writing, but also just being like super nosy. I guess now we call it professionally curious, but it's just nosy. So yes, I worked in my high school paper, worked on the college paper. I would highly recommend, if it's still around, I think it's now called the Dow Jones News Fund. When I did it, it was the Dow Jones Newspaper Fund, and they connect you with newspapers that you work at. I did that. Worked at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And then this is like, if this was a drinking game, you would drink now. I also worked at the Windy City Times with Tracy Bame. Everybody take a drink. And I've gone on to do a million other things, I feel like. And thanks to Tracy, I'm now at the Chicago Reader. And I just am grateful every day that I have the background I have, and that I stepped out of journalism and have been able to step back into it. I don't know, Adam, if you can talk a little bit about your career path. I know when I was a student, I was always really curious about how people got the jobs they got. So
yeah, totally. I just want to give a special shout out. You did not mention Rebellious, the fabulous feminist magazine that you founded. So I just, along with being the co-publisher and my editor, the Reader, Karen has a fabulous publication that she founded. So that adds to the mix. But in terms of what got me my current job at the Reader, like Kate, I kind of graduated into a crisis, not a recession, but a pandemic. And so that was very, very fun. Like went to grad school, thought I was gonna like work at like the New York Times and everything, which, you know, thinking back now, bad idea. But I was at Medill for the graduate, starting in 2019. I went in pretty much a crystal clear idea. It's like, I want to do queer journalism that like serves queer people and is like not about queer people. And when I was like getting close to graduating, a professor, but actually this is usually my barometer for like if it's a good opportunity for me or if I have to apply for something, like truly like about 12 of my friends sent me the posting for the fellowship, the social justice reporting fellowship. And it was like friends I also hadn't like talked to in years. So it just like felt like the universe sending me a sign like, you need to do this. And I applied. And I have been told that my references hounded Tracy and Karen to hire me, which was very funny. And then I like essentially hit the ground running at the Reader, like reporting on queer people in the queer community in Chicago. And I think it was August 31st was my first day as a fellow. And then now I'm a staff writer of the paper. But previously, before Medill, I was a private equity reporter in New York. I covered like the legal system, but like bounced around like a couple of beats. I covered like antitrust issues, sports law. I don't know what they were thinking assigning me that. And just eventually like private equity and like capital markets. So far cry from what I'm doing now. How are you, Karen?
Oh my gosh, capital markets, that just like gave me twitches. I also like hope people take away from this that like some of us have journalism degrees, some of us don't, some of us have undergrad degrees in other things and journalism degrees and master's degrees. Some of us have, I took 8 years off between undergrad and grad school. So I think anybody who tells you your journalism path, hopefully you're not still being told this, that it has to be this linear path. Like it's totally not true. And especially for marginalized people, it's really never going to be true. So just want to call that out as a takeaway. So Adam, one of the things I appreciate most about working with you is that you always have a million stories rolling and they're about a million different things, like from super, super serious to just like, I want to write about tchotchkes. Like, okay, where to do it.
Exactly. Exactly.
How do you come up with story ideas? How do you get inspired to write about all of the things you write about?
I think it's there are a couple layers to it. Number one, I think like the like sillier stories, like, you know, the tchotchke essay. Like I just filed an essay about like the FDA's disclaimer about like using poppers, or like the culture of queer beaches. So for those ideas, I kind of just like, it's just like what I'm thinking about. And it was like, I want to write about it. Thankfully, Karen and the culture editor at the paper, Salem Kolojuland, are just like very willing recipients of like essentially like the shit posting ideas that I have. And I was like, I want to write about a beach. It's like, go for it. But in terms of like the very serious stories that I cover, you know, like the racism in North Halsted, HIV criminalization in Illinois, number one, I just think I get my ideas from, you know, like the experts and activists and like researchers that are in my like source list, just like things that they're talking about or issues that they're highlighting. But I also make a point to like follow a bunch of other publications and see, like, you know, like under, like as they're reporting on queer issues, what are issues that are left out? What are issues, what are people, or where, like, what are the cracks that stories could be falling through? And I usually try to like fill that. But I also just like kind of get a lot of my story ideas like from social media, people like raging about a certain thing or like speaking out about something. I think we all understand like the power of social media now. And so that's primarily where I got a lot of my ideas.
Yeah, that's great. And I feel like I also, like the last question, back when I was a reporter, the last question was always, is there anything I didn't ask you about that you wish I had or that I should have asked? And then, you know, if you have somebody on the phone or have somebody who's really hard to get a hold of, also asking them, are there any stories that you feel like you wish you would see people cover? Or is there anything that's missing in my coverage or anything that's missing in coverage in general? Like if you have somebody and, you know, a famous person or somebody who's an advocate, like absolutely picking their brain, I feel like is something I always try to do.
Yeah, that's definitely it.
Are there any, I know you mentioned social media, are there any folks that you check in with regularly or who you really try to, whose feeds you try to follow? Like, are there people you look to like, okay, this person's gonna know what's going on, or any organizations?
Yeah, definitely. I think particularly here in Chicago, like Brave Space Alliance is a huge one, particularly because it's the only like Black trans-led LGBT community center in the city. And I mean, to be frank, I think they do very different and much more like community focused work than like the Center on Halsted. Lucille Stuhl and Molasses, the mutual aid group that she started out of the Chicago Black Drag Council, obviously the Chicago Black Drag Council, but a lot of, I admittedly like to steer clear of what I call the big box agencies, like, you know, Heartland Alliance, Center on Halsted, because like number one, as my reporting has like sometimes shown, those agencies can be antagonistic toward the queer community, even though they like supposedly like are serving the queer community. But then also I find that people like Brave Space Alliance, like Lasaya Wade, the incredible executive director, Stephanie Scora, who like does work there as well, they're really in tune with on the ground issues, and they speak much more frankly and much more transparently about like what the community is facing in day-to-day struggles. And so the people that I really turn to are the on the ground activists doing the work, and the people who are just like kind of speaking out on social media or through their various either professional or like volunteer affiliations. What about you, Karen? Who do you look at?
I mean, I'm also a social media junkie, right? And I do the same thing that you do, is I read other publications and see where the holes are, where the gaps are. I think a lot of breaking news, and the other thing I didn't mention, I used to work for the Associated Press, and one of the things, I loved being a breaking news reporter because my days were always different, but I also really relish the opportunity to dig deeper on stories, which is not something you get to do necessarily at the AP, and that we have the luxury of doing at the Reader. And so I think looking at people's kind of daily coverage and seeing, okay, and that they leave it, right? Like, as we've all talked about, like, you talk to somebody on the worst day of their lives about the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to them, you extract all of this information and emotion from them, you write your story, and then you go off to the next thing. And nobody circles back to that person, and nobody comes back to that that story and that community and that situation and checks in with them. So I feel like I also look for those holes in reporting, and just, you know, whatever that person went through is probably still happening to them or happening for them. And that is also part of the story, and part of the story that we should be telling. So kind of along that line, like, Adam, what's the most impactful story or stories that you've worked on, and why are they impactful for you personally, and how do you think they've been impactful for the community?
I think there are two stories that stick out pretty explicitly, and they're both Chicago Reader stories. Number one is the HIV criminalization in Illinois story. And I think that one is particularly effective because, you know, the law was overturned. The HIV criminalization law was overturned. I am not going to say I took credit for that at all, because number one, the law was introduced while I was reporting on this story, but also people have been like organizing around this for years. But I think it really, in that situation, that was something that every kind of like public relations or like press facing person that I spoke with had no idea that this is a thing. It like boggled the mind for almost like most of my sources that this exists. And I think it's effective because it did a lot of education, but the central focus of my story was a man by the name of Jimmy Amuchavi, whose circumstances were frankly really, really egregious. Like, he was wrongfully accused, he was like abused by the police, things like that. And over the course of my reporting process, I was able to kind of help him recover and repair that a little bit. You know, like, as I said in my story, like, I helped him get his mugshot taken down from the Chicago Tribune. And I think it was also effective because nobody had followed up on his case and shown that the charges were dropped. And so I was able to kind of I was able to show a more complete picture of his circumstances that was more truthful and more fair to him than any other writing had been. In terms, the other article that I'm thinking of was the North Halsted racism story. I'm particularly proud of that because the Chicago Black Drag Council, Lucy Sewell, the people involved in that have been very outspoken about like journalism that they found objectionable relating to like the issues of race and voice in North Halsted. And my piece was like the only one that they liked, that they said like really was truthful to the struggles happening in the community. And so that's just something I'm rather personally proud of.
Love it. Look, I'm checking for the chat. All right, we have 11 minutes, and I want to make sure we get to some advanced questions, that folks have a chance to ask questions. So let's you and I wrap up, Adam, and do a plug. Let's answer some questions in the chat, and let's do a plug for the organization that we are both involved in. So one of my questions is super loaded. Like, are there any professional organizations for journalists, for BIPOC journalists, for LGBTQ? Oh my gosh, I gave it away. LGBTQ journalists to be involved in, to create community for professional development, for networking, just for finding your people? I know you're a member of a couple.
Yes, so I'm the local chapter president of the National Association of LGBTQ+ journalists. We're not going to use the acronym because it's not inclusive, but I'm also a very proud member of the Trans Journalists Association. So those are two organizations that are very near and dear to my heart. I try to provide as much community in that role as I can. I'm like one of the only trans chapter leaders. So like I do a lot of work on behalf of like the trans journalists in Chicago. But those are just two organizations that have like connected me with a lot of fabulous people and have helped my professional development a lot.
And I will say I'm a national board member of the Association of LGBTQ journalists, and there is an absolutely fantastic student project through that organization at the conference every year. We did it virtually last year, which was an experiment, but if you are a student or if you've graduated within 6 months of when the conference happens, you can apply, and it is a week generally of reporting, and you get paired with mentors. And the last few years, the mentors have been from, unfortunately, the New York Times. But if you're excited about working at the New York Times, it is a way to interact with those people. And I think the last thing I'll say before we take questions is I am a big fan of morale in newsrooms and self-care. And so actually I'll end with that question, Anna, before we move on. Like, you've reported on some really traumatic things for the community and have talked to some people like we've said, you know, going through very difficult things. How do you, as a reporter in all these intersecting communities, how do you take care of yourself?
That's actually a really good question. I think that's something we're all, or like journalists are really waking up to the idea of like the impact our stories have on us. You know, we talk about like pandemic reporting as crisis reporting. But you know, as reporters who are covering the marginalization of like our own communities, it can like be very emotionally taxing to be like, okay, I just wrote a whole story about like this queer person who was like horribly abused by their employer, and now I'm just gonna go home and I guess sit with that in my head. I like to take a kind of like solutions journalism approach to my work, that I'm not just like talking about someone's struggles, but like or like a human rights abuse, but also like the ways that like these kind of things can be overcome, or the work that somebody is doing to improve circumstances for somebody else. Like, let's say I'm working on I'm writing a story right now about like how common the gay and trans panic, or the LGBTQ plus panic defense is across the country. And you know, it could absolutely just be a story about like, oh, look at all these people using this like horrifyingly outdated criminal defense strategy. But also part of the story is like, what are people doing to ban this defense? And what are people doing to like make sure this doesn't happen to other people? So in my reporting, I, again, you know, focusing on the solutions journalism and not just like highlighting people's trauma. But then I think I also, in terms of my reporting, the silly stories that like get tchotchkes and like poppers things, those are actually kind of part of my self-care. I think it's important for me to like write about things that just like make me happy and that are just like silly. And over the interview process, I don't have to like ask somebody about like the worst day in their life. So I think it's a mix of that and also just, you know, like my emotional support system at home. You know, the dogs, Brandy, all that. I'm surprised the dogs have not Zoom bombed, admittedly. What do you do? They're asleep, which is the only reason.
I was gonna say no hibachi sighting on this call.
She's asleep. That's truly the only reason. She and Randy are past everything. But what about you? What do you do to take care? Because you know, you're editing all of my stories. You like read them.
I am very forthcoming about having an amazing therapist. I fortunately had her before the pandemic, and now we've pivoted to Zoom, and hopefully we'll see each other again. I feel like I as coming from the Black community, obviously had a lot of stigma about seeking therapy, and eventually just got over it and was looking at my family like, okay, y'all all have opinions about therapy, but you're all completely mad. Like, I also don't want to be you. So how do I undo this if I don't seek my own therapy? So I highly recommend it. I know it can be really hard to find mental health professionals now, but I highly recommend. That is definitely a huge part of my self-care. Louise, I'm going to ask your question. Unless, can you ask your question actually? I know you've come off mute before.
Sure. I wanted to ask, what kind of relationship should we foster with the people and communities we report on? Should routinely checking in be part of our role and responsibility as reporters?
Do you want me to take that first, Karen?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, totally. So I think I like to think of my role in the community as kind of a partnership, frankly. I like to see myself as like a conduit for queer, trans, Black people to like have their issues like respected and written about in a way that affirms them and does not like, that is not transactional. I think when I report on when I do these tough interviews for, you know, the HIV criminalization story, I'm very explicit. I say, you can like tell me to fuck off with these questions. Like, if I'm asking a question that you don't like, tell me. If there's something after the fact that you want like taken out, we can absolutely talk about it. But like, I frankly always give deference to somebody because I don't know particularly what their circumstances are. And that happened with like Jimmy Amuchavi. He was just like, you know, I think I've talked about this enough, and like it's really bringing up a lot of difficult feelings to talk about this. So I say, okay, you don't have to anymore. Like that is absolutely your right. And I think that's kind of afforded me a lot of respect in the community, because I'm not just like coming in wanting to extract trauma and then like leaving. But I also, in terms of like the checking in, that's something that I do like almost every week. I always will shoot an email or a text to like Stephanie Scora or Lasaya Wade and say like, hey, how's everything going? And I think it's also important to just like, it sounds weird, but like just chit chat with people too, because that you want them to understand that you're interested in them as people and not just like a mine for stories. Like I don't text Stephanie and say like, hey, got a story for me today? It's like, hey, how's your week going? I hope you have a happy Monday. Like things like that. I think, you know, I mean, my undergraduate journalism career, my undergraduate professors would like be dying right now if they found that out, because like they were the people. It's like, you can't like be friends with people, but you know, if I'm like in the community with people, like it's hard to like separate myself from people that like I could see out at a club or like that like also like materially impact my life as a queer person. So I like to have a very close relationship with my sources. I mean, I'm not inviting to like birthday parties or things like that, but like I want my sources to see me as a person first and not like a reporter. And I want to see my sources as a person first and not a source first.
I love that so much. I'm not going to add to it. All right, Emma, thank you so much. Well, I will say one last thing. You don't want to be transactional, but low-key, it is also a wonderful way to build a beat. Keeping in touch with people, and yes, the chit-chatting, story ideas come out of the chit-chatting because people don't realize how rich and how wonderful what they do every day is. They're in it and they don't realize like, no, that's totally a story. What you just said to me, like in passing as a thing, totally a story. So I feel like that is also a way to be human, but also to like build your beat.
Yeah, and I can even provide an example of like how that's helped me report on something that nobody else reported on. There was a hospital here in the city that like there was some activism around a parking lot that was going to be sold. It was like the emergency department's parking lot, which is a little confusing. I don't know why they would sell that parking lot. And so there was some journalism about like, oh, neighbors are upset because there's not enough like affordable housing in the community. Like I think in the proposed space, there was like three, oh, bye, May. There were three affordable units out of like 300. So like the community was really focusing on that. But I got an email from Stephanie Scora over the Brave Space Alliance that said like, hey, nobody's really talking about the fact that this hospital has the only center for gender confirmation surgery in the state or in the Midwest. And, you know, while the center is not like based in the parking lot, people are concerned that like the development of this parking lot could signal further development of the hospital, which has this very important center. And I was the only one to report on that. I think it's because I have cultivated a reputation of just like very respectful, nuanced coverage of the trans community and the queer community in the city.
All right, so Tracy, you answered my question. If we can go a little over, obviously, if you have to go, you got to go. If you're done looking at our faces, please feel free to go. But we'll, Tracy, give us a warning when we're like over.
Yeah, we can go. Let's say we can go about 5 minutes over. We can go longer, but I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Yeah. We'll definitely send out the recording for those who have to leave early. You know that you can save the chat if there's links and questions and things you wanted to. You can do save chat. You know, we'll definitely send something out. If you want to get in touch with anybody on the call, we're happy to share that information as well.
All right, Anna, I wanted to get to your question. Do you want to come off mute and ask?
Great. Yeah, I can totally do that. So my question was for both of you about like what you would love to see in the future of queer journalism, and not just in like our practices of how we tell stories, but what stories we're telling to begin with.
I will let you start with that.
Okay. Oh, okay. So I honestly am hoping that more queer outlets start, that we strengthen existing queer outlets and that we actually have more of them, because I think of course, there are more of us working at mainstream outlets, but there are always going to be limitations to it. And I feel like you're always going to butt against people who say like people who found out when Tracy and I were coming into the leadership of the Reader, like, oh, is the Reader going to turn queer now? Like, okay, because that's how it works. Thanks, y'all. Right? I feel like you're always going to have that. And so I obviously come from the queer press, and I just am really hopeful that the future includes more more like queer newsrooms, because I feel like I also want people to have the experience of working in a newsroom with all other wild queer people. It's so much fun, and it's so much fun, and like newsroom culture does matter a ton. It matters so much more than I think any of us can really express about the stories you're able to tell and the experience you have as a human, as a worker. So that's my answer for the future of, short answer for the future of queer journalism.
Yeah, I mean, like in that vein, like this is the first job I've had where I don't have to explain like the most basic aspects of queer identity to somebody. Like at my last job, like I would literally have to like, you would just be like, oh, we have to explain who trans people are in like a story that like was like boilerplate. It was like, I'm not going to be like someone's queer 101 reporter here. Like you're gonna have to do some work to understand people. I mean, just to echo that, I want like more robust queer press. I want like a well-funded and well-respected queer press. But I also want the stories that mainstream publications tell to move beyond just like the white cisgender queer person, or like the very surface level struggles that the queer community faces, and like, you know, interrogating the trans people who die in ICE custody, or why Rikers is not safe for trans women, like things like that. I think, you know, the mainstream press is such a just like a very overarching view of like what the queer community is. They treat us like as a monolith, that like the issues impacting like me are going to be the same as issues impacting like a Black trans woman, and that's just like not true. And I think the mainstream press has so far to go in terms of respectfully and properly covering our community. So I think I'm just hoping it gets better, but I think it will get better through robust queer press.
Can we, Karen, could you, or any of the editors really, there's one question that's kind of practical for a lot of the journalists here, and that is how they get pitching, how you're open to that in the processes. Maybe Karen, for you could do it for the Reader, and Andrew for Windy City Times.
Sure, and to that, covering the queer future of journalism, I would also say, as Adam was saying, I hope that we have more stories about queer joy. Like, it's always stories about queer trauma and queer problems and terrible, terrible things, how terrible it is to be, oh God, to be an LGBTQ person in America. Like, let's tell some stories about joy too. Like, there's just not enough room for that. So just want to name that. So pitching. I have, fortunately, I have to say, gotten out of the pitching business. So don't pitch to me. You can pitch it to me, but just know I'm gonna forward your email. It's exhausting to do it right. As an editor, it is exhausting to respond to pitches in a thoughtful, respectful way. And I just know I don't have time for it. So I'm out of the biz. However, all the other editors at the Reader are in the biz. And I would say, research the editor you're pitching to. If you're writing a music story, don't send it to the culture editor. Figure out who it needs to go to. Be clear, like editors are very vain people. And even though we know that you're like talking to other people, we want to pretend like you're the only person, like we're the only person that you want to hang out with. So if you're simultaneous pitching, let us know that. If you're pitching at the Reader, maybe erase the Sun-Times, the Dear Sun-Times editor from the top of the email, right? Like, just be careful.
I feel like it's a very specific story.
I cannot tell you at I mean, it happens to me at Rebellious all the time. Not so much at the Reader, but Rebellious, people are clearly pitching a million different places and they just don't even, they cut and paste them. I see you.
Sirs or madam is like the...
Right, exactly. And the last tip I would give is, you pitch a story, along with your pitch, include something else about you. Like, this is why I want to write this story. These are the kinds of things I'm interested in. And I say that because I had somebody whose pitch I didn't take, who writes for the Reader because I assigned them something. Like, I'm not going to take your pitch, but I know you also covered this thing that I would love to have covered back when I did do pitches. So I'm going to see if you're interested in covering that thing. So don't just send the pitch. Like, you don't have to give your whole life story, but say like, these are the things I'm interested in covering. These are the things I've had published about those things. Please keep me in mind for future opportunities.
Andrew?
Oh, Adam, did you have something to say?
Yeah, really quick. I will also say that like a rejection is Definitely not a comment on you, on like your work. I wrote a piece about HIV treatment access in Puerto Rico. And I finished the story like literally March 2020. And so absolutely nobody was taking a story about like HIV in Puerto Rico then. I pitched it genuinely like 10 places, like Times, Wall Street Journal, BuzzFeed had eventually like circled back and took it. But like, just because like a rejection is not always a comment on like your work or the story or the validity of that story. Sometimes it is unfortunately a matter of circumstance. And you know, like editors told me, it's like ordinarily we would love this story, but like there is a like pandemic that is like freaking everyone out right now. So like maybe not the time. So I think like don't be discouraged by a no, because it is not always about you. You're saying something, Andrew, sorry.
Oh, no, it's cool, it's cool. So you hear the phrase, you know, everyone has a story. You don't realize until you become an editor. So you get all of these pitches from people. And as much as I would like to cover every story or have Windy City Times cover every story, we just can't, you know. The staff, we only have a certain number of people. What I tell people, and Karen, you touched upon this actually, is to tell a story, is to say something about yourself as well as pitch a story. We get a lot of stories that are the same too, a lot of pitches that are the same. So, I mean, it's hard to stand out, but I would say try to sound as sincere as possible, because there are some that come across that sound very boilerplate. And I always do urge people, even if we don't accept your pitch this time, feel free to pitch other stories, because you never know when something might strike the right chord with us. So that's all I have to say.
Great. Karen, I don't know if you guys want to take one more question and then we'll wrap it. Is there anything else?
Oh, please.
I have one I want to take. So this question is about hearing about where podcasting may contribute to queer journalism now and moving forward. So I'm just going to use this the starting point really quick as a plug for the Chicago Readers new queer podcast, Chicago Queer Now. Kind of some of the stuff we've talked about is very relevant here. We focus on like queer joy and like how much fun it is to be queer on the podcast. That's like a through line that we always try to incorporate. But I think, thank you, Ken. But I think, you know, the Gender Reveal podcast, Chicago Queer Now, there's so many podcasts out there that like are showing the nuance and the different identities that like make up the queer community. And so I think podcasting is a fabulous space because it also allows people to tell their own stories in their own voice. And that's something I really, really love about podcasting, is that, you know, I don't have to explain someone's identity in a way that may be inauthentic to them, because I allowed them through the medium to like literally speak for themselves. And so I think, especially in a community where individual identity is so important and so unique to every person, that is a space that I have found particularly affirming for both my sources and myself.
Great. Thank you all. Do you have anybody have any final things they want to say? This was so enlightening. I learned a lot after all my jaded years in this business. I learned a whole lot, and I really respect that you took a couple hours of your time, all of you. Today, we're going to send you the recording. And if you have any follow-up questions or connections you want, we're happy to share those. Thanks everybody for being here today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Everyone is
Thank you so much. This is so great.
Bye.